Doctors told a billionaire that his only son had 9 days left to live. No cure, no chance, just a countdown to goodbye. But while the father prepared for the worst, someone in his house refused to give up. His quiet maid, the woman who had cared for the boy like her own, made a secret, life-risking decision that would leave the world in shock. What she did next defied science, broke every rule, and changed their lives forever. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. It began like any other childhood illness, a few bruises on his legs, tiredness that never went away. Richard thought it was something simple, something children outgrow. But after countless tests and hospital visits, the truth hit like a knife. Lau had a rare and aggressive form of cancer, one with no effective treatment and no known cure. The diagnosis broke him. He had lost his wife years ago. Losing his son too felt impossible. He poured his fortune into treatments, chemotherapy, immunotherapy, clinical trials, everything the world could offer, but none of it worked. Lau's small body grew weaker with each passing week. His hair fell, his skin turned pale, and yet he never once complained. When the doctors finally said the words, "There's nothing else we can do," Richard stopped sleeping. His mansion turned into a quiet hospital. Machines hummed in every room. Nurses moved like ghosts through the halls. And in the middle of it all, Lau lay in his bed, calm, fragile, and impossibly brave. The boy didn't understand how sick he was. He only knew that his father looked sad all the time, and that made him sad too. Still, he smiled whenever he could. He asked for bedtime stories, drew small doodles on napkins, and held his father's hand whenever he fell asleep. He never talked about death. He just talked about tomorrow, as if he still believed there would be one. Richard tried to match that hope, but the truth was unbearable. Each night, when Lau finally closed his eyes, Richard sat in the hallway, staring at the wall, wondering how much time they had left. The house had become heavy with silence, a silence that reminded him of grief and of failure. And then came Amara. She wasn't new to the family. She had worked as their housemaid for years, quiet, devoted, and invisible in the way only the most loyal workers are. But when Lau fell sick, her role changed. She became the steady presence Richard didn't know he needed. Amara moved with a calmness that filled every room. She spoke softly, smiled gently, and never seemed to lose control, no matter how bad the days got. On the worst mornings, when Richard couldn't even bring himself to speak, Amara was already sitting beside Lau, spoon-feeding him soup, humming a song from her childhood. Lau adored her. He called her Mommy Number 2. At first, Richard didn't know how to feel about that. But when he saw the comfort she brought, the warmth she restored to his son's world, he let it be. Amara never saw it as work. She saw it as love, a second chance to save someone she couldn't save before. Years ago, she had lost her younger sister to illness. No money, no treatment, no help. That pain had followed her every day since. Now when she looked at Lau, she saw her sister's face. And this time, she refused to lose. As the days passed, Amara became more than just a maid. She was the heart of the home, the calm between grief and panic. She always knew what Lau needed, sometimes even before he did. If he couldn't eat, she'd make up stories to make him laugh. If he cried, she'd hum softly until he stopped. Even the doctors noticed it. They said Lau's heart rate slowed when she was in the room. He rested better when she held his hand. It was as if her presence itself was medicine. But despite all the love surrounding him, Lau's condition kept worsening. His body was giving up, even if his spirit refused to. The beeping of the machines became slower, more rhythmic, a cruel reminder that time was running out. One morning, when the air outside the hospital was still grey with dawn, Lau looked up at his father and asked a question Richard didn't expect. "Dad, can I have a birthday party?" It stopped him cold. The boy's 7th birthday was only 2 weeks away. The doctors weren't sure he'd even make it that far, but when Richard looked into his son's hopeful eyes, he couldn't say no. He smiled weakly and said, "Of course you can." That moment changed everything. The house that had been silent for months suddenly came alive. The nurses started talking about decorations. Amara made lists. Even the doctors offered to help. Lau wanted a superhero theme, red and blue, like Spider-Man and Superman. He wanted balloons, cupcakes, music, and a cake with both chocolate and strawberry. "Half and half," he said proudly, as if it were the biggest decision in the world. Planning that party gave everyone something new to hold on to. Hope. For the first time in months, Richard saw color in his son's eyes again. Every morning, Lau asked how the preparations were going. He even chose his outfit, a bright red t-shirt with a lightning bolt printed across the chest. Amara worked harder than ever. She stayed up late, painting banners by hand, cutting paper stars and humming while she taped decorations to the walls. The hospital room slowly transformed from a place of despair into a space of celebration. And even though everyone knew why, they were doing it, that it might be his last birthday. Nobody said it out loud. They just kept moving forward, holding on to the only thing that mattered, Lau's smile. The day of the party arrived, and for a few precious hours, the hospital didn't feel like a hospital at all. The walls were lined with red and blue streamers. Superhero cutouts danced under soft lights, and balloons floated near the ceiling. Nurses wore paper masks, pretending to be comic book heroes. Even the doctors came by, smiling quietly, pretending they weren't fighting tears. Lau sat in his hospital bed, dressed in his red lightning bolt shirt, his small legs tucked under a blanket. His cheeks were pale, but his eyes shone with excitement. Amara stood beside him, adjusting his pillow, checking his oxygen tube, and whispering, "You look perfect, little man." She had barely slept for days, but no one would have guessed. Her smile never left her face. Richard watched from the corner of the room, unable to stop filming every second on his phone. For the first time in months, his son wasn't a patient. He was just a boy having his birthday party. Friends from school came, carrying handmade cards and small gifts. Nurses brought cupcakes. One of them even set up a bubble machine that filled the air with shimmering lights. Lau giggled, reaching for the bubbles as they drifted near him. His hands trembled, but he didn't stop trying. For a while, the pain and fear seemed to disappear. The sound of laughter replaced the sound of monitors, and right in the middle of it all was Amara. She moved quietly, making sure everyone had juice, that Lau's blanket stayed warm, and that the cake was ready. Every time he looked at her, he smiled, a look that said, "I'm safe because you're here." The celebration went on for hours. Small games, soft music, quiet joy. Everyone knew what this party meant, but no one spoke about it. The unspoken truth lingered like a shadow, that this might be the last time they saw Lau smile like this. But Amara didn't allow sadness to take over. She kept the energy alive, cheering softly whenever Lau unwrapped a gift or made a tiny joke. Her strength was invisible but powerful, the kind that held everyone else together without them even realizing it. When the cake finally arrived, Lau's eyes widened, half chocolate, half strawberry, just like he wanted. 7 small candles flickered on top, each one fighting the hospital's air conditioning. "Ready?" Amara whispered, holding his hand. Lau nodded. He took a deep breath, his chest rising weakly, and blew them out one by one. Everyone clapped. Richard couldn't hold back his tears. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped, as if this single breath could erase every dark day that had come before. After the applause died down, the room grew quiet. Lau looked at Amara, who was fixing the blanket on his legs, and asked softly, "Am I going to live?" The question hung in the air like thunder. No one moved. The nurses froze. Richard, standing near the window, turned slowly, unsure if he'd heard right. Amara stopped what she was doing and looked at him. Her lips parted, But no easy answer came. She couldn't lie to him, not this boy who had faced every truth with more courage than most adults ever could. She reached out, took his tiny hand, and said in a calm, steady voice, "I'm with you. I'm right here, okay?" Lau stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Okay." He leaned back against the pillow, as if that was enough. And maybe it was. Maybe that was all he needed. Not a promise, but presence. Richard stood there silently, his heart breaking all over again. He realized in that moment that Amara wasn't just helping. She was carrying them, both him and Lau, through a storm he no longer had the strength to face. After the guests left, the party decorations stayed up. Balloons still floated, the scent of frosting still hung in the air, but everything felt heavier. Lau had fallen asleep, his small hand still gripping Amara's fingers. She didn't move. She just sat beside him, humming softly, her other hand brushing his hair from his forehead. Richard watched from the hallway. He didn't want to interrupt. There was something sacred in the stillness, a kind of love that didn't need words. That night, when the lights dimmed and the nurses went home, Amara stayed awake. She sat at the kitchen table long after everyone had gone to bed. A laptop glowed faintly in front of her. Medical websites, research papers, transplant cases. She scrolled through them slowly, eyes tired but focused. She had seen something earlier that day, a spark in Lau's eyes when he blew out the candles. It wasn't a goodbye, it was a wish, and she wasn't ready to let that wish die. For hours she searched. Words like liver transplant and living donor appeared again and again. She read about rare cases where unrelated donors had saved children's lives. The risks were high, the procedures were complicated, but it was possible. She leaned back, staring at the screen. Her hands were trembling. What if she could do it? What if she could be the one? The next morning, before anyone else woke up, Amara left the house quietly. She carried a small folder with her, ID, medical records, savings. She didn't tell Richard where she was going. She didn't want to raise false hope. At a small clinic across town, she filled out forms and requested compatibility testing for organ donation. The nurse asked if she was related to the boy. She said no, not by blood, but by heart. The nurse smiled faintly and didn't ask again. Hours later, Amara walked out of the clinic, exhausted but certain. If there was even a 1% chance she could save Lau, she was willing to risk everything. She didn't tell anyone. She just went back to work, same as always. Cleaning, cooking, caring, carrying a secret that no one else knew. And when Richard thanked her that night for making the party so perfect, she only smiled and said, "He's still smiling. That's all that matters." He had no idea that while he was trying to survive the pain of losing his son, Amara was already preparing to save him. Days passed after the party, but the question Lau asked, "Am I going to live?" never left anyone's mind. It lingered in every quiet hallway, in every whisper between nurses, in every sleepless night that followed. Amara carried it differently. To everyone else, it was a question of fate. To her, it was a call to action. She went on with her daily work, cooking, cleaning, organizing medications. But behind the calm routine, something inside her had shifted. She had already taken the first step. The blood tests were done. The results would come soon. And deep down, she prayed to be the match Lau needed. She didn't tell anyone, not even Richard. She knew what he'd say, that it was too dangerous, too impossible. But Amara had already made her decision. One evening, when the house had gone quiet, her phone rang. She answered softly, careful not to wake Lau, who was sleeping nearby. The voice on the other end belonged to a doctor from the clinic. "Miss Amara," he said, "the results are back. You're a full compatibility match." For a few seconds, she couldn't breathe. The doctor repeated himself a little louder this time. "It's rare, but you're a perfect donor. If the child's condition allows, a partial transplant could be considered." She thanked him in a whisper, hung up, and sat frozen for a long time. A perfect match. Out of thousands of possibilities, fate had chosen her. It wasn't joy she felt. It was gravity. The kind that presses on your heart when you realize you've just been given both a gift and a burden. Amara looked toward Lau's room, where the faint glow of a night lamp lit his sleeping face. She knew what she had to do. That night, she barely slept. She spread the documents out on the table, test results, medical notes, printed guidelines about living donors, and began planning. She wasn't reckless. She was determined. Every risk she read about, every potential complication, every warning, she absorbed it all, but none of it scared her. She'd already lost one child in her life. She wasn't going to lose another. The next morning, she went to the main hospital and requested to speak with the transplant department. When they finally let her in, she explained everything: her test results, her intention to donate, her relationship to Lau. The doctors listened politely at first, but their expressions shifted when she said the words, "not biologically related." One of them sighed and said, "I'm sorry, ma'am. That's not permitted without legal authorization. You'd have to go through an ethics committee, a family verification process, and that can take months." "Months," she repeated, her voice breaking slightly. "He doesn't have months." They exchanged sympathetic looks, but sympathy wasn't what she needed. She needed permission. Amara stayed calm, though inside she wanted to scream. "Please," she said, "he's my boy. Maybe not by blood, but I raised him. I feed him. I sit by him every night. I know him better than anyone." A doctor placed a hand on her shoulder. "We believe you," he said gently, "but the law doesn't." She walked out quietly, holding the folder against her chest. By the time she reached the hospital gate, her eyes burned with tears she refused to let fall. She had never felt more helpless, and yet she wasn't giving up. That evening, she finally told Richard. After dinner, when Lau was asleep, she called him into the kitchen. Her voice was soft but firm. "There's something you need to know." Richard sat down, sensing the seriousness in her tone. Amara told him everything: how she'd gotten tested, how she'd kept it a secret, how she'd been denied permission that morning. For a moment, he just stared at her. You did what?" "I matched with him, Richard," she said. "Completely. I can save him." His eyes widened, disbelief and panic mixing together. "You can't just decide something like that." "You could die!" She didn't flinch. "If I don't, he will." He stood up, pacing. "No, Amara, I can't let you do this. It's not your responsibility." Amara looked at him calmly. "It's not about responsibility. It's about love." The silence that followed was heavy. The ticking clock on the wall felt louder than ever. Finally, Richard whispered, "You've already done enough. Please, don't risk your life too." Amara nodded quietly. "I understand." But deep down, she knew she wasn't done. That night, while Richard believed she had accepted his decision, Amara sat awake with her laptop again. She searched for hospitals overseas, places with more flexible policies. Hours passed before she found what she was looking for: a medical center abroad that specialized in complex transplants and had handled unrelated donor cases before. She read every word on their site, every success story. Then she composed an email, long, honest, desperate. She attached her test results, explained Lau's condition, and ended with a single line: "If you'll take us, I'll bring him myself." 2 days later, a reply came. The doctor on the other end said he understood. He had lost a daughter years ago because no donor could be found in time. He promised to help, quietly, discreetly, without red tape. Amara printed his message and folded it into her folder, right next to her test results. Her decision was no longer a secret plan. It was a mission. Over the next few days, she prepared silently. She packed a small suitcase, arranged transportation, and contacted a nurse she trusted to help her move Lau without alerting anyone. She left detailed notes on household matters for Richard, as if she were going away for errands, and prayed he'd forgive her later. When everything was ready, she stood by Lau's bedside that night, brushing his hair gently as he slept. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale under the lamp. She whispered, "We're going on a little trip tomorrow, my boy. Somewhere new, somewhere safe." He didn't stir, but his tiny hand twitched against hers, as if he knew. Before leaving the room, she placed a folded piece of paper in her pocket. It was her test result, proof that miracles sometimes come disguised as ordinary people. At dawn, Amara carried Lau into the car, helped by the trusted nurse. The city was still asleep as they drove through quiet streets toward the airport. For everyone else, it would have looked like a desperate act. But for her, it was something much simpler. The only thing that had ever made sense. A mother's choice, made by a woman who wasn't won by blood, but by heart. By the time the plane touched down in the new city, the sun had just begun to rise. A pale orange glow washed over the clouds, soft and quiet, almost as if the world itself was holding its breath for what was about to happen. Amara carried Lau in her arms through the hospital doors, clutching the small folder of documents she had kept so carefully hidden. The staff had been informed of their arrival. They spoke little, their movements quick, efficient, discreet. The man leading the team was the same doctor who had written back to her, the one who had lost his own daughter years before. His name was Dr. Mendez. There was kindness in his eyes, the kind that comes from grief. When he saw Lau asleep in Amara's arms, he nodded softly. "You did the right thing bringing him here," he said. "We'll take care of him." Tests began immediately. Blood work, scans, cross-matching, every step was double-checked. Hours passed in a blur of beeping machines and quiet urgency. Amara stayed close to Lau the entire time. She held his hand, whispered stories, and hummed softly to calm him down. When Dr. Mendez returned with the results, he looked at her with steady eyes. "The match is still perfect," he said. "We can do this, but we have to move fast." Amara nodded without hesitation. "I'm ready," he hesitated before replying. "You understand what this means, don't you? This isn't a small surgery. There are real risks, for you especially." "I understand," she said quietly. "Do it." That night, Amara sat beside Lau's hospital bed, the machines humming softly beside them. The room was dim, just one lamp glowing near the window. Lau was half awake, drifting in and out of sleep. "Mommy number 2, he whispered, his voice barely there. "Are we going home soon?" Amara smiled and brushed his hair back gently. "Soon, my love. After you rest a little, okay?" He nodded weakly and closed his eyes again. She stayed still for a long time, just watching him breathe. The rise and fall of his chest felt like the rhythm of her own heartbeat. Sometime past midnight, she took out a small piece of paper and began to write. Her handwriting was slow, deliberate. When she finished, she folded it neatly and placed it in Lau's hand. It said, "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." Then she kissed his forehead, whispered something only he could hear, and closed her eyes. At dawn, they prepared for surgery. The hospital was still, the corridors quiet. The air felt sacred, heavy with fear, hope, and something bigger than both. When the nurses came to take Lau to the operating room, he was drowsy from the anesthesia. Amara followed close behind until they reached the point where the hallway split. One direction for him, one for her. She bent down, kissed his cheek and whispered, "I'll see you soon, baby." Then they wheeled her away. Back home, the silence didn't last long. Richard's phone rang while he was on a business trip abroad. When he answered, the voice on the other end spoke words that made his blood run cold. "Mr. Whitmore, your son has been admitted for surgery. The donor is listed as Amara." He froze. For a few seconds he couldn't speak. Then he whispered, "That's not possible." But it was. The person on the line explained everything. The documentation, the tests, the consent forms. Amara had done it all in secret. Within an hour, Richard was on the next flight out. He didn't pack. He didn't call anyone else. He just moved, driven by a panic so deep it hurt to breathe. The flight felt endless. Every minute felt like an hour. When he finally landed, he ran through the airport, straight into a car waiting to take him to the hospital. He didn't notice the city lights or the noise, only the sound of his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. By the time he arrived, both surgeries were already underway. Dr. Mendez met him in the waiting area. His face was calm but serious. "They're both stable for now," he said. "It's a delicate procedure, but we're doing everything we can." Richard sank into a chair, his hands shaking. He stared at the door that led to the operating rooms, praying silently, promising everything he had if it meant they would both survive. Hours passed. The world outside went on, people working, cars moving, time existing. But for Richard, time had stopped. Finally, after what felt like forever, Dr. Mendez returned. His gloves were off, his eyes tired, but there was relief in his voice. "The surgery went well," he said. Both of them made it through. Richard's knees gave out. He sat down and covered his face with his hands, shaking with quiet sobs, not of sadness, but of disbelief. He followed the doctor down the hallway. Through a glass window he saw Lau first, pale, fragile, connected to machines, but breathing. He was alive. Then in the next room he saw Amara. She was motionless, her face pale, her hands still. The monitors beside her beeped steadily, proof that she was still here. There was a folded note on the table beside her. Richard picked it up with trembling hands and opened it. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." He pressed the paper to his chest and whispered, "Thank you." 3 days later, Lau opened his eyes. Richard was there, holding his hand. The boy blinked a few times, confused by the lights and the sounds. Then he smiled faintly. "Can I have cake?" he asked. Richard laughed through tears. "We'll see, kiddo." Then Lau looked around and asked, "Where's Mommy number 2? Richard swallowed hard. "She's resting, buddy. She had to do something very big to help you." Lau nodded slowly. "She'll wake up soon," he said confidently, before drifting back to sleep. Everyone in the hospital knew the story by now. Nurses, doctors, patients. They all whispered about the maid who had risked her life for the boy she loved like her own. The staff took turns checking on both of them, leaving small gifts in their rooms, balloons, cards, toys. Days turned into a quiet rhythm of waiting. Richard split his time between the 2 rooms, talking to one, praying beside the other. And then, on the 5th morning, it happened. A nurse rushed down the hall, smiling. "She's awake." Richard ran. He burst into the room and saw Amara's eyes fluttering open, her breath shallow but steady. Beside her, sitting in a chair he wasn't supposed to be in, was Lau, smiling from ear to ear. "Mommy number 2, he said softly. "I'm alive." Amara froze. For a second she couldn't speak. Then tears filled her eyes. She reached out weakly and touched his face. The room went silent as the 2 of them just looked at each other, the woman who gave and the boy who received. Richard stood by the door, watching in awe. No words were needed. The moment spoke for itself. Minutes later, Dr. Mendez entered with test results in his hand. His smile was wide for the first time. "The transplant was successful," he said. "And Lau's new liver is working perfectly. His cancer cells are no longer multiplying. He's in remission." Amara covered her mouth with her hand, tears spilling freely now. Richard couldn't stop shaking. He walked forward, took her hand, and said the only words that mattered, "You gave us back our life." News of what happened spread quietly at first, whispered through the hospital halls, shared among nurses, then reaching the doctors, and finally the world outside. A maid who had given part of her liver to save the billionaire's dying son. It sounded like a headline made for fiction, but it was real. Richard tried to keep it private, but stories like that don't stay hidden. Within days, journalists began calling. Reporters waited outside the hospital, and strangers sent flowers and letters. People from all over the world wanted to know the woman's name, the one who risked everything for love that wasn't bound by blood. Amara, however, wanted none of it. She refused every interview. When one reporter asked how it felt to be a hero, she simply said, "I didn't do it to be one." Her only focus was Lau. Recovery wasn't easy, not for either of them. Amara's surgery had been complex, her healing slow. Lau's small body needed time to adjust to the new organ, to accept it as his own. But every day brought progress. His color returned. His appetite grew. The dark circles under his eyes faded, replaced by curiosity, laughter, and endless questions. He'd wake up asking, "Can Amara eat breakfast with me today?" Or, "When can I go outside again?" The hospital staff adored him. He had become a symbol of hope. Doctors who'd once seen nothing but sorrow in that ward now smiled when they walked by his room. Amara was moved into the same recovery wing as Lau. Their rooms were just steps apart. But most days Lau found a way to sneak into hers. He'd sit beside her bed, drawing pictures on her medical charts or telling her stories about his dreams. Once he said, "You gave me your light, didn't you?" Amara smiled weakly. "Something like that," she whispered. When Dr. Mendez came in with the final test results, his tone was different, lighter, proud. "Both of you are healing beautifully," he said. "It's rare to see recoveries this fast. I think we can call this a miracle." It was. After nearly a month, they were discharged. Richard carried the paperwork in one hand and held Lau's hand in the other. Amara walked beside them, slow but steady, her face pale but peaceful. As they stepped outside into the daylight, the air felt new. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel the weight of fear in his chest. The world kept talking about the story. News anchors replayed footage of their return, calling it a miracle of compassion. Hospitals began reviewing outdated donor laws. Even government officials spoke about it publicly, using Amara's act as an example of what humanity should stand for. But Amara ignored the noise. She went back to work quietly, back to her routines, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. She cooked, organized, cleaned. Only now, Lau followed her everywhere like her shadow. He helped her stir soup, carried folded napkins, and called her Mommy Number 2 louder than ever. Richard tried to convince her to take time off, to rest, to recover properly. She always smiled and said, "Rest is easier when he's laughing." He couldn't argue with that. In the months that followed, their home changed completely. The sterile machines were gone, replaced by music, laughter, and sunlight through open windows. The smell of medicine was replaced by the scent of cake and flowers. For the first time, life felt normal again, warm and loud and imperfect, exactly the way it should be. Richard found himself watching Amara differently now. Not as an employee, but as the woman who had given everything for his child. The more he saw her with Lau, the gentleness, the quiet strength, the unwavering care, the more he realized how much of their family's heartbeat came from her. He never said it out loud, but the truth was simple. She had saved more than Lau's life. She had saved his too. A year later, Lau turned 7. The house that once held silence now roared with laughter. The backyard was filled with balloons, colorful tables, and children running across the grass. Nurses from the old hospital came to visit. Neighbors brought gifts, and this time it wasn't a fragile celebration hiding behind fear. It was pure joy. Lau ran around in a bright blue cape, pretending to fly. His hair had grown back, his cheeks full again, his laughter loud and contagious. Every few minutes he'd shout, "Mommy Number 2, look!" And Amara would turn, smile, and clap, pretending to be amazed each time. Richard stood at the edge of the yard holding a camera, capturing it all, the moment he had once believed he'd never live to see. When the cake arrived, a towering mix of chocolate and strawberry again, everyone gathered around. Lau stood between Richard and Amara, grinning wide as candles flickered in front of him. "Make a wish," Amara said softly. He looked at her for a long moment, then at his father. "I already got it," he said. He blew out the candles, and cheers erupted across the garden. Later, when the guests had gone and the house was quiet again, Richard walked into the living room and saw Lau asleep on the couch, frosting on his shirt, toy cape tangled around his arm. Above him, hanging on the wall, was a framed note. The one Amara had written before the surgery. "If I don't wake up, know that Mommy said yes." It sat there like a quiet promise, a reminder of the night love decided to fight death and win. Richard turned toward the kitchen, where Amara was cleaning up the last of the plates. She looked up, smiling. "He fell asleep again?" He nodded. "He had a big day." She chuckled softly. "He always does." For a moment, they just stood there in silence, not the kind that comes from sorrow, but the kind that feels like peace. Richard glanced at the note again and said quietly, "You know, I never thanked you properly." Amara shook her head. "You don't have to. I already see it every day." She looked toward the couch, at the sleeping boy who had once been given 9 days to live. "He's my thanks." Richard smiled. "He's all of ours." That night, when the lights dimmed and the house finally went still, the world outside continued moving, unaware that inside one quiet home, 3 lives had already lived through something extraordinary. A billionaire who learned that money can't buy miracles. A maid who proved love doesn't need blood to be real. And a boy who was supposed to die, but lived because someone said yes. And that was the story of the maid who gave her life. A reminder that love isn't defined by blood, but by the choices we make when it matters most. Amara didn't just save a child. She proved that courage can rewrite fate itself. Now tell us, what part of this story moved you the most? Comment your thoughts below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more heart-touching stories like this one.